Today's venue is absolutely gorgeous, and you know what, it's 20 miles from my house and I've never actually been here before. We're right on the edge of the Peak District at Damflask Reservoir. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different here today because I'm actually going to fish the slider. It's one of my favourite ways of fishing. It's very popular on the continent, and if you enjoy watching a float go under on big natural venues like this video is for you. Slide on. Plumbing up on a slider can be a little bit tricky, but I like to make it really easy for myself, and I do that by having a totally separate rod just for plumbing up. And the setup on it's really simple. I've got an ounce distance lead at the bottom with a snap link, which is very significant, and I'll talk to you more about that later. Then a very buoyant 15-gram slider with all them little brass discs taken out, and it's actually a peacock one, so it's really, really buoyant. So what this setup will do is the bomb will go to the bottom, and because the float is so buoyant and heavy, it will fire up to the surface in a really straight line, so you get a direct, fast, accurate reading on it. Now, I've had a little plumb up before, so I'm just going to run you through it again now, but it's pretty flat here today, and I've chosen to fish about 35 metres out from me, and I'm going to cast it out this and just show you what I'm going to do. So plumbing up, I've actually got this rod already clipped up, but when you're fishing a slider you need to cast in and then sink your line. So I actually, when I've hit my clip, I actually count back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 turns and then take the bail arm off, and by doing that you release the line and the float can rise up to the surface. And the reason for counting back them turns is because I want to sink the line. So casting beyond where you want to fish, then winding back with your rod under the water helps you sink it. And as you can see, looking out there now, my float's popped up. And as I've said, I've already plumbed this up, but I just wanted to show you guys and girls. That float's popped up and it's sticking out of the water about 4 inches. So what that'll mean is, if I was to put a hook on where my bomb is, I'd be fishing 4 inches over depth. So what I'm going to do next, I'm just going to pull it back a little bit, like so, maybe a couple of meters, and just make sure that the area I'm fishing is flat, because you don't want to chuck it there, pull it closer and it be 4 or 5 foot deeper all of a sudden. As you can see, my float's riding back up, absolutely beautiful. And I've picked that distance today, it's quite far, 35 meters roughly, and the reason for that is because it's nice and calm. So I'm not going to struggle to cast there and fire my bait there. If it were windy, obviously, just like any method, you have to fish a little bit closer to you and tailor what you do to the conditions. So I'm happy that's plumbed up to dead depth now. So that float's sliding up, hitting that slider knot, and I know it's perfect. So now I'm going to use this rod and lay it against my actual fishing rod and set the slider knots at the same place. So I know I'm fishing absolutely dead depth, and I'll show you how to do that right now. I've got both rods laid out on my roost next to each other, and the first thing to do is hook the snap swivel onto the hook ring on the rod, and then place the hook on the fishing rod in exactly the same place. So your hook and where your bomb is on your snap link is in exactly the same place. That way you're 100% accurate. And then make sure that the bend in the tips is very light, hardly under any pressure, just so there's no inaccuracies. If you tighten one right up on your roost and leave one slack, obviously you're going to get different depth measurements. So just pay attention and make sure the tips are the same tension. And I then simply set my slider stop knots on my fishing rod in exactly the same position as they are on the plumbing up rod there. So I know that that slider that I'm fishing with there is perfect dead depth, just like the one that I've plumbed up on. It's very easy and simple, as long as you make sure them few little accuracy points are taken care of. Final thing that I do like to do is just put a little mark where my slider knot is. You can use a Tipex pen. I use a little black marker and you can wipe it off really easy at the end because I don't like white Tipex, all of them in ice rods. And that way you've got a reference point. So today I'm going to fish about 4 inches over depth. So I'm going to move my slider knots deeper by 4 inches there from my mark. So now I know I'm fishing 4 inches over depth, and that way you can always come back to your mark, dry off the bottom, go further on the bottom, and it's just like marking where the tip of your float is on a pole. You've got a reference point, so you're super duper accurate. When you're fishing a slider, you need to know how to tie a stop knot. It's something a lot of people struggle with, but it's really, really simple. If I can do it, anyone can. I like to use quite a low diameter line for mine. I think they make a nice, neat knot, and a thinner line than what you're using for your main line doesn't seem to dig in quite as much. So I always use 0.17 N gauge. Don't think it really matters, but for me, that's a nice mediocre diameter. Give yourself loads to work with. I'm going to bite off around 18 inches there, and the way to actually tie it, keep your line nice and tight over your knee and try and tie the slider knot at roughly the depth you're going to be fishing, because that way you ain't got to drag it all the way up and all the way down your line, so you're going to reduce your chances of damaging your line. And the way I always tie it is to lay the length of N gauge against the main line and then double this back on itself, so you're making a little loop here with one length of line laying against your main line and this second bit of line coming back towards it with a little loop trapped between your finger and thumb, and then twist this loose line back around both bits of line. And I do it around 7 times, 5, 6, 7, something like that, and then this loose end of line needs to go back through the loop that you've created at this end. It's a little bit fiddly, and now you'll see, keeping hold of both bits of line at this end, and by pulling the loose bit of line at that end, give it a little bit of the magic spit. Just as it's tightening up, you'll see both bits coming together nicely, and then I just neaten it up by nudging both ends in with my fingers. Give it a tug tight, but don't tighten it right up until it's in the position where you want it. So I've actually got a knot on here already. I always tie 2 because it just makes them extra secure, and if one comes off, you've always got a spare. And I just buffer them up against each other, and obviously, depending on what the depth is, when you've plumbed up, you'll set them. But I then give it a little bit more of a firm pull. Now, this bit is important. It's then time to trim the tags, and what I'd advise you don't do is trim them too close, because I don't think that it matters about them flying through the rod rings like people often say, but if you leave yourself an 1.5 inches or so, you can still get hold of the tags and re-tighten it. So a little bit of a longer tag, don't think it matters about the eyes, but it's good for tightening them back up. And there you go, there's 2 knots buffered together nicely. And you should be able to keep them nice and firm so they won't move when your float slides up against them. But if you do need to change the depth, as you can see there, I can move them knots about perfectly. And that is the stop knot for the slider. So now that I've set my depth, I've plumbed up using that plumbing rod, and I've got both rods set at the perfect depth. I've just got to make sure they both clipped up at the same distance, and I do that by using my distance stick. Simply lay the plumbing up rod bomb next to the starting point, the stick on the left, and then count how many wraps around the sticks it is until you hit your line clip where you clipped up to. Once you've got that, you can then wind it in. You know that it's, say, 16 wraps on them sticks. You then get your actual fishing rod. I always clip a plummet onto it and place the plummet where the bomb is, which means you'll be super duper accurate, and then wrap round the same number of times. And that way you're casting to that same point every time. You're counting back them 7 turns every time, so your float's going to end up in the exact same position. My ground bait mix that I'm using today is a little bit of a sweet and sour combination because half of it's fish meal and half of it is a cereal mix. It's Sweet Marine and Proactive mixed 50-50, and the reason for that is there's lots of skimmers in here and I know they like fish meal, but I also like that bready, sticky nature of Proactive as well. So if in doubt, half and half of each. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually measure out what I'm going to fire out at the start of the session, and the way that I do that is I use my 200ml pot because I know that a one-handed ball that I'm going to feed on the slider with my catapult makes approximately 200ml. So I'm going to fire 15 balls out at the start, so 15 of them are going into this bucket. So this mix here is my initial mix that I'm going to feed at the start, and then I'll use that for topping up a little bit later. So now I'm going to choose what particles I'm going to put into that initial mix, and I don't like feeding loads and loads of particles at the start for skimmers. I like to see what's there initially, and I can always top up and fire some balls in. So I'm going to feed just over 100ml, so half of this pot, of a mixture of finely chopped worms, some dead maggots and dead pinkies, and a few casters as well. So just always use a little pot, and you've just got a gauge, even if you don't do it super accurate, you've just got a gauge of how much you're actually feeding. So there, just over half of a pot, so that's about 125ml, and I'm going to put that into them 15 pots of bait, give it a good mix up, and make up my balls to fire out. Now the reason I'm not putting loads of bait in at the start is because these venues are very deep, the water's very cold still running off the Peak District, and when you're fishing a slider, obviously you're firing your balls over quite a big area. You might seem like you're quite accurate firing them towards a float, but they're probably landing on the area of maybe a car. So if you've got lots and lots of particles in each ball, fish can feed quite aggressively over that without picking up your hook bait. Whereas if you've got a nice carpet of bait with not many particles in, they're a lot more likely to pick up your hook bait, because that's the one that will stand out. And like I mentioned, you can always top up with some richer balls, but I don't know what's going to happen here today. I've not been here before, so I'm erring on the side of caution. So feeding at the very start of the session, a little tip for you, always use your plumbing up rod to put out there as your marker, because obviously with that heavy bomb on the bottom and the buoyant float, once it's set in place, it doesn't drift off in any tow or flow that you might have, so you can fire your balls at the same point. Again, it's all about being accurate. So I'm going to cast her in, try and get a banging line with my far bank marker. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 winds back on the reel, and just let that line out. And that float now, when it pops up, she should be up in a moment. There she is. That should be in just the right position and stay there while I'm actually going to fire my balls in. Now the catapult you use is very important. It's also very personal. I've had my catapults for years. I spend a long time getting them right by actually trimming the elastic down so that I can only pull it back a certain distance. I know how big a ball to put in it, and that way them balls will go roughly the same distance every time. Again, it's just another way of being accurate, and you can't always put them on the float every time, but if you pull that back as far as you can. That one's a little bit past, so I'd just give this one a little bit less. And again, try and look at the far bank marker, and look down the elastic on the pouch, and you tend to get them nice and accurate. I'm quite happy with them. They're all going in, you know, a couple of metres of the float. One of the most important things to think about and do when you are slider fishing before you actually fire your bait out is consider how big and what shape you make the balls you're going to feed. Now, I like to make mine with one hand, and you've got to try and make them all a similar size, because obviously they're the same weight then, the same shape, so they'll fire very accurately. You want to get into a rhythm of firing them. If they're all the same or similar weight and size, they'll go a similar distance. So I use one hand and get a rough shape like so, but then I just nip the edges off the ball and tidy it up by using both hands. And you almost want an enlonged barrel sort of shape that's very even. If you've got any lumps and bumps on it, that can catch when you put it in the pouch of the catapult. So a nice smooth ball that fills the pouch, nothing too small and nothing too big, but nice and smooth with a little bit of an enlonged shape, and you'll find that ball fires nice and evenly, the same distance or similar every time. And again, you can probably see why it's important to make them balls nice and hard, because you put them under quite a bit of pressure when you're firing them out like this. Mr. Duck's just followed a ball in on my float. That one knocked the paint off, I think. Last one. First cast of the day, always exciting, and I'm gonna go for 2 dead red maggots. And the reason I like a dead one on the slider is because there's less chance of it wriggling over the point of the hook. So 2 dead ones. I always hook them through the thin end, so I've got loads of hook points showing. And one thing I want to talk about early is when you're actually casting a slider out, you need to slow everything down and be nice and smooth, because any sort of jolty moves cause tangles. So a nice smooth cast, hit your clip so everything straightens out, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 winds back. I'm in the middle of that area that I've baited up, and I've let my bail arm open so the line's released off my reel and my float can slide up, and there it is, she just appeared. And once she appears and she's hit that stop knot, you can flick your bail arm back over and get ready, and try and keep everything pretty tight, because when it goes you want to pick up nice and firmly. I hope we get a bite quick. You can see that yellow tip perfect. I wonder how many fish are over that bait now. It's not been in long. I have seen an odd one topping. Oh, that were an indication, that definite. Oh, first chuck, wallop. I had a feeling we were going to catch, you know, on these places, when you see fish topping, you know they're in their area, and you normally do catch them. Wonder what it is. Might have seen then I gave it a good old firm strike. That's important, because you've got to pick up that big 10-gram Olivet. You've got to strike through all that line. That's what we come for. Lovely little skimmers. Look how dark they are, them. When it comes to tackle for slider fishing, simplicity is key, because if you try and do anything fancy or complicated, trust me, I've been there myself, you end up in tangles. Kicking off with the hardware, rod wise I've got a 13-foot Aventus float, and it's quite important to pick the right rod for slider fishing, because floats are quite heavy, 10, 12, even up to 15 grams, so you need something with some power in the bottom end. Anything too nice and light, you might have a few issues. But by the same token, I'm fishing for small fish, roach, skimmers, little fish with soft mouths, so I need some absorption and softness in the tip, and this has the perfect balance. Loads of power at the bottom end with a lovely soft action at the top. On my reel, I've got 8-pound Pulse Pro, and that might sound like a heavy line for float fishing, but again, you're punching a big float out repetitively. You might be casting a few hundred times in a day, and it takes its toll on your main line. And another reason for that heavy main line is again to reduce tangles. Your float sliding up and down on that, and something a little bit thicker and stiffer prevents any tangles. It's something Will Raisin told me a long time ago. Yeah, you could probably get away with 6 pound, but go one heavier and it eliminates any problems. On to the actual rig setup now. I'm just going to lower this down behind me so you can have a nice close look. Now, on my actual main line, the first thing I slide on is a little tiny plastic bead. It's got a really tiny little hole in it, and the reason for that is that's going to buffer up against my stop knot, which is up here somewhere. I'll explain more about that later. But a little tiny plastic bead. I've then got a float threaded on my line, and today I've gone for a 3 + 12 gram perfect slider, and you'll notice it's got some little discs of weight in there, what I've added to it. And the reason for that is I put my chosen weight down the line, which today on a 12 gram float, it's a 10 gram Olivet with a few number 8 shot. And then I actually shot the float down by adding these little brass discs to it, just to take it to where I want it. And having that bit extra weight in the float helps it sit against the Olivet when you cast, and again reduces tangles. So onto the actual rig itself, I've got a 10 gram Olivet with 1 number 8 shot above it and 4 below. And that actual Olivet, if I just pull this away, you'll notice is sitting on a little loop to loop there. And that loop to loop goes from my 8-pound main line here to some 0.25 pure fluorocarbon. And you can actually just pull the Olivet onto the top of it, like so, to hide that little loop to loop, and it sits nice and tight on top of it, and then place your shot either side. So all that connection is hidden in the Olivet. Now, the reason for 4 number 8s below is just to give it a little boom and kick out, again, preventing tangles. And the reason that I've got 0.25 pure fluorocarbon below, I've got a full metre of it, is because that's thick and very, very stiff. So when you cast out, it flies past your float, the stiffness stops it wrapping around it, but because it's fluorocarbon, it's heavy, it's stable in the water, and it's almost invisible underwater. So a metre length of that below the Olivet, and then down to the very terminal end, I've got a little quick change swivel just there to attach my hook length, and right above it I've got another 2 number 8s. Now you always need a little bit of weight down this bottom end when you're slider fishing, because when you hit your line clip or you stop your float, a little bit of weight helps fly your hook bait and this bottom end of the rig past it. Again, it's all geared towards not getting tangles. And then I've got a 12-inch hook length of 0.12 pure fluorocarbon and a 16 feeder special hook. Might change that, hopefully, to a bigger one if we're catching, but a simple rig with the aim of preventing tangles, offering stable presentation and good bite detection. I'm excited now. I don't get to do this very often, and I'm massively regretting not coming to this venue before, because it is beautiful. Nice smooth cast, hit your flip, 7 winds back, and hopefully already you can see, even though you're fishing in 17 feet of water here today, I've got roughly 35 metres out away from me, you're firing balls of bait out, you can still be super accurate. I'm fishing about 3.5 to 4 inches over depth, and that is imperative for them small fish. If you've got loads of line on the bottom, you wouldn't see the bites, and straight I saw that bite within 10 seconds of my float setting. You know what's gorgeous? With all them big trees on far bank, they cast a big dark shadow, and you can see your float like a beacon. It's just tripping through from left to right slightly. This is a little box of tricks for you as well, and I've talked about my float already, but one little aspect of my float that's important is the actual tip that I've got in it. And I've got a few different colours of tips and a few different diameters in here, and the reason for that is because when you're fishing 30 and 40 metres out with a float, light can change, there's different shadows on the water, and the most important thing is you can see it and you're getting the right kind of presentation. So for me, there's 2 different diameters of tips. I've got the thinner one that's a little bit longer, and I use that when conditions are calm, I'm fishing for small fish and sensitivity is key. Usually when I'm using the thinner tip in my slider, I'm fishing with just a little bit of line on the bottom. 4 or 6 inch, they're perfect for them crafty little skimmers that give you little slow pulls or little lifts. So that's the thin tip, and then the thicker tip, it's more than double the diameter of the other one, but they're great in poor light, which you sometimes have when you're fishing all that way out, and they're also good when the lake, reservoir or even river is towing, because they won't drag under as easily. And obviously on the slider you're fishing on the bottom, so as your float moves along with a bait on the bottom, it can drag under, and that thicker tip is a little bit more buoyant and it'll pull your bait along with it. So thicker tip for more line on the bottom and tow, thinner tip for sensitivity. And a final little bit of advice I've got a few little magic ones in here that I've prepared over the years. When you're fishing for small fish on a slider, actually colouring these tips in 2 different colours using a Sharpie, just half of them black and half of them the other colour, or vice versa. I've got loads of different variations. It just helps you see little indications, because obviously if you were fishing for these fish on a pole, you'd have a sensitive tip and hardly any line on the bottom. So you need to do everything you can to see the bites properly out there. And by having lots of different colours, if that float lifts up just an inch or 2, I'll recognise it and I can strike. So a few little Battenberg style different colours, little daddies they are. Getting an odd little indication. I sometimes think straight after feeding, this first sort of 15-20 minutes, there's that much bait in the swim spread out, bits popping off them balls we've fired in, that the fish are sort of eating the little bits of free offerings that's come off and they're not quite settled. You tend to realise that because you miss an odd bite and you get a few indications. Hopefully though, they'll settle down on the bottom on that bait once they find it and everything's sank and settled properly. Now we're only a few fish in, but I'm sure you can see already why rod choice is so important for this kind of fishing, because you've got to pick up and have some backbone to lift that line, olivette float and set the hook. But catching these smaller soft-mouthed fish, you need that absorption as well, and that's where the action in the tip, I hope we've got a Percy, the perch, that's where the action in the tip comes along nice and soft, so you're not going to bump little fish off. One thing that is important, I don't know if you saw them, when my float does go under, I'm not keen to strike immediately. You've almost got to give it a, right, that's gone under, I'm going to strike, and then pick up, because you're fishing so deep down, you've got all that line out, and you need to make sure them fish are hooked properly, the bait's in the mouth, and when you're fishing all that way out, a few extra seconds just to make sure they're on ensures you come back with one most times. You might have noticed I'm delving into my little tub of horse muck here, and that's because I've changed to putting 2 bits of redworm on the hook. Caught them few early fish, and I just want to see if there's any better ones hanging about there, and a good way of trying to select a bigger fish is to play around with your hook baits. So worms normally pick out a better fish. I've got on there now 2 1.5 pieces of redworm, and I've still got that pinky on. I think in these kind of big venues that little bright flash on your hook bait is important, so 2 bits of redworm and a pinky. Got me a couple of quick bites already. Just hoping it'll pick out an odd bonus fish. There's got to be some kicking about in this place, it's massive. One thing that I do want to talk about is rod positioning, especially when you've just cast in. Obviously you're going to sink your line 6 or 7 turns, but then your rest and the position of your rod now when we're actually going to sit and fish and wait for a bite is very important, because you need to be comfy but it needs to be set so you're ready to hit bites. And I've found the best positioning for me is to have a long reaper, any long rest, right in front of you. Reason for a long one is you can put your rod down in any position roughly in front of you without worrying about it. So if you want to watch your float, make up a ball, whatever you're doing, your rod's set and ready, and you want it pointing in front of you so you've got maximum power when you strike up. More movement means you can connect with a float quicker and more firmly, if that makes sense. And the other thing to consider is where your actual tip of the rod is in relation to the water, and you want it just touching it just above, not under and not miles off it, because if you have your rod miles off the water, you get a lot of slack line between your rod tip and where the line goes into the water. And again, if your rod's too far under, you've got to drag it out on the strike. So just touching the water or just above it means everything's nice and tight to the float. So when it goes under, you can connect with a fish. Another fish. Now things have definitely slowed a little bit recently. We had a real mad spell about 20 minutes, half an hour in, and then things settled down lovely, but bites have slowed down. This is a nice little skimmer again, but I feel like we should be getting bites a little bit quicker. And I almost want to feed again. I think a little bit of noise, a little bit of activity will bring a few more of these in. I feel like when we fed initially we missed a few bites, probably because there were too much bait in the peg. So on these top up balls, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually fish, and these next 3 or 4 casts I'm just going to fire a ball out each cast just to get a little bit of noise happening in my peg and a bit of something falling through the water and build up a little bit more bait. So I'm not going to fire 3 or 4 in one go. I'm going to fish, and I might fire 2 in, I might fire 4 in. I'll see how it goes, but I'm just going to start being a little bit more aggressive with bait. An additional little thing to remember when it comes to ground bait is when you're slider fishing, you've got to squeeze a ball quite hard to get it out to 20, 30, 40 metres without it breaking up. So don't over wet your mix, because if you make your mix nice and stodgy and then squeeze it firmly, it won't break down on the bottom, whereas something on the dry side, squeezed firmly, will still break down, be nice and active and attractive, and pull fish in your swim. So always err on less water rather than more. Look at that, straight away, 1 ball in, went about 3 foot to the left of my float, that did. And some people would think it'd scare fish off, and we've got one. That must be 45 seconds after that ball went in. Show you, don't put them off, often it'll bring them back in. Nice skimmer. I'm hoping the camera boys have got you a good shot of the float, because I've actually put another number 9 shot on it just to dot it to a pimple. Them little skimmers, they're so crafty. When they suck in your bait, they stay still and hardly pull it under. Today, bites have just been little drags, almost like you're dragging bottom, and by having your float dotted to a pimple, even when you're fishing all that way out, it can make a big difference. It doesn't matter so much for big fish. When you're fishing for these smaller skimmers, roach, that kind of thing, it does help. So don't be scared to have a little bit of finesse and dot your float down when you're catching them fish. There we are, look at that little tiny plink, little pull. And he's on. And I'm sure if I'd have got an inch or 2 of float sticking out, I wouldn't have got that fish. Well folks, I hope you've enjoyed today as much as me, because I've absolutely loved it. Totally new venue to me on one of my favourite methods, and if anything, the thing that I wish for the most is that you've seen a little bit of slider fishing, learnt a little bit, and hopefully you can go out and have a pop at it yourself. You know what? Camera boys might be leaving now, but I'm gonna stay for an hour because it won't go dark till about 9 o'clock now.